Hello everyone, we are group number 4 and welcome all of you to our video today. To begin our video, let me ask you a question. Why did the United States become involved in countries like Vietnam and Cuba despite their very different geographical positions and political contexts? Was it simply about expanding power, or was there something more complex behind the decisions? The answer is more complex than you might think, and it is closely related to what is known as American pragmatism. So in this video, we will explore US pragmatism in economic foreign policy after the Cold War, focusing on the cases of Vietnam and Cuba. So first of all, foreign policy can be understood as a nation strategy book, a structured set of goals and actions used to manage relationships with other countries. The strategy book typically includes 4 key pillars: security, diplomacy, strategy, and economy. While all 4 pillars are important, this video focuses specifically on economic dimensions. Among these pillars, what truly defines US foreign policy is not strict adherence to ideology, but pragmatism, an approach in which decisions are adjusted based on practical interests and changing global conditions.
Hello everyone, my name is Fung Min. As you watch the video, you may be asking yourself, what is pragmatism? Basically, American pragmatism has been defined in various ways, but in our video, it is an approach that prioritizes practical result over rigid ideology. It focuses on what works in reality, judging policy by their outcomes, rather than abstract principle alone. To understand why pragmatism became so important, we need to look at what happened after the Cold War. So, after the Cold War, the Soviet Union collapsed and the US became the only superpower, the last man standing. This created a strong sense of confidence. Even overconfidence, many Americans believed their system was the best and should be spread over the world. This idea is often called American exceptionalism, the belief that the US has a special role to lead, to promote democracy, and to step in when needed, even using force. However, this confidence was challenged by costly and prolonged conflicts, which exposed the limits of idealistic policy. As a result, U.S. foreign policy shifted toward a more pragmatic approach, emphasizing flexibility and cost-effectiveness. In this sense, pragmatism was not simply a choice, but a necessity. Instead of asking, how can we reshape the world, policymakers ask, what can we achieve without overextending resources? Based on this perspective, this video analyzed the U.S. economic pragmatism through the 3 key dimensions: interest, constraint, and policy outcomes. Together, these elements help explain why the United States has adopted different economic approaches toward Vietnam and Cuba.
So, why do we choose Vietnam and Cuba as comparative cases? Vietnam and Cuba are selected as comparative case studies because they represent 2 historically significant yet contrasting examples of US engagement with communist countries. Both countries were ideological adversaries of the United States during the Cold War, yet they differ substantially in their geopolitical positions, economic potential, and domestic political implications for the US. From a pragmatic perspective, these differences allow us to examine how US foreign economic policy is shaped by the interaction between interests and constraints under varying conditions. In this framework, Vietnam represents a case where strategic and economic interests outweigh constraints, leading to deeper engagement. In contrast, Cuba illustrates a case where domestic political ideological constraints limit policy flexibility, resulting in more restricted and conditional engagement. So, now let's see how the US implemented pragmatic policies. The US has implemented its pragmatic approach toward Vietnam and Cuba through policies that reflect different configurations of interests, constraints, and outcomes. In the case of Vietnam, US policy reflects a situation in which economic and strategic interests are strong, while constraints have gradually weakened over the time. From an interest perspective, Vietnam offers a rapidly growing market and increasing integration into global supply chains. It also holds strategic importance in Southeast Asia, particularly in relation to regional security and the rise of China. Historical tensions stemming from Vietnam War initially limited cooperation. However, These constraints diminished over time due to the normalization efforts and changing geopolitical priorities. As a result, the policy outcome has been a deepening of economic engagement. Key milestones include the normalization of diplomatic relations in 1995, the bilateral trade agreement in 2000, and Vietnam's accession to World Trade Organization in 2007. Especially the 2023 Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, which prioritizes cooperation in critical technologies, economic, security, and innovation. For example, under the CHIPS, or we call CHIPS, and Science Act, the United States has begun supporting semiconductor workforce development in Vietnam, signaling a long-term strategic economic alignment. And Vietnam is among 7 countries in the world that the US has chosen to be the producer of the semiconductor chips. In contrast, US policy toward Cuba reflects a situation in which constraints remain dominant despite limited strategic incentives. While Cuba's economic value is modest compared to cases like Vietnam, its geographic proximity sustains its relevance within a traditional sphere of influence logic. Policy is shaped by entrenched constraints rooted in historical events, like the legacy of Cuban Revolution, which transformed Cuba from a US allied regime into a socialist country and triggered large-scale nationalization of American assets, leading to the US trade embargo imposed in 1960, alongside the fall of Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought superpowers to the brink of nuclear war, have institutionalized distrust and threat perception. As a result, US policy has taken the form of calibrated duality, selective engagement alongside enduring restriction. This case demonstrates that pragmatism of the US in foreign policy is not solely interest-driven, but bounded by historically embedded and domestically reinforced constraints that can override material incentives. Taken together, these 2 cases highlight a key feature of US pragmatism. It is not applied uniformly, but operates conditionally based on the balance between interests and constraints.